Sand dunes are aeolian, or wind-formed features, most commonly found in hot deserts. But these dunes by no means have to be found in hot deserts. Sand is actually found everywhere in the world, and this is because it is simply created from weathering, or the breaking down of rocks. Forces such as wind, water, and even the sun breaks rocks down into finer grains. These fine grains are sand, or even smaller, silt. However, in most other places with a lot of rainfall, this sand will either be merged with the soil or swept away into rivers, eventually making their way into a large body of water. Not only this, but precipitation also creates vegetation, and vegetation stabilizes dunes and prevents it from being blown by the wind. In deserts, this lack of precipitation prevents the sand from moving out into the ocean and prevents vegetation from stabilizing the sand. However, dunes found in hot deserts are not the topic of today's video. Instead, we are going to look at another way dunes are commonly formed, that being glaciers. As glaciers are moving through a landscape, they scour or scrape the rocks and turn them into the fine grains. Then, as glaciers retreat, the sand will usually be caught in the large meltwater streams and make their way down into rivers or lakes. And finally, other actions such as the drying up of lakes will reveal these dunes and allow them to be blown by the wind. These glacially created sand dunes is the central process that we will be investigating throughout several examples in today's video. The first place we are going to look at is Alaska. Alaska today has 3 different active dune fields, and all of these dunes originated from the same glacier, that being the glacier which grew over the Brooks Range. Over thousands of years, this Brooks Range glacier would scrape the rocks into the fine grains of gravel, sand, and silt. And this is the origin of sediment in our Alaskan sand dunes. However, the way the sand traveled from our Brooks Range to our dune sites and the interaction that the sand had in these regions differs between our 3 dunes. Starting off, we have the dunes that are closest to the Brooks Range, these being the Great Kobuk Sand Dunes. Today, these sand dunes cover around 16,000 acres in area and are found in mainly 3 active dune locations, that being the Great Kobuk Sand Dune, the Little Kobuk Sand Dune, and the Hunt River Sand Dunes by the banks of the Kobuk River. So as the Brooks Range Glacier was melting from around 17,000 to 15,000 years ago, the immense amount of water that came from the glacier poured out into the Kobuk Valley here. This brought the eroded sand into the valley. However, instead of the sand continuing out into the ocean, it would instead get trapped within the Kobuk Valley here. And that's because the Kobuk Valley is naturally shielded on almost all of its sides. To the north, we have the Baird Mountains, part of the larger Brooks Range. And to the south, we have the Waring Mountains. These 2 mountain ranges made it so that when the sand came into this region, not all of it would be able to reach the ocean, and it instead collected into the valley. In fact, more than 200,000 acres of active sand dunes were in the valley at its peak. However, as I mentioned earlier, the sand dunes are down to just 16,000 acres. So what happened that shrunk down the size of these dunes? Well, it is the vegetation process that I mentioned earlier. Over the roughly 14,000 years that these dunes have been around, vegetation has been slowly reclaiming and stabilizing the dunes, leaving only the few remaining patches of active dunes in the Kobuk Valley today. In modern day, the active regions of the Great Kobuk Sand Dunes are still shifting. They are primarily migrating to the west or northwest due to easterly winds during most of the year. And this has created the pattern of dunes that face to the west and northwest that we can see today. The dunes are now protected by the very large Kobuk Valley National Park, one of the least visited national parks in the country, and it is actually bigger than the state of Delaware. To visit the park and the dunes, you need to fly in by plane, most likely from Kotzebue. The next set of dunes in Alaska are found roughly 100 miles to the southeast, and these are the Nogahabara Sand Dunes. The Nogahabara Sand Dunes are much smaller than the Great Kobuk Sand Dunes, coming out to be around 10,000 acres. And they also have a pretty similar story to the Great Kobuk Sand Dunes. As I mentioned before, the sediment came from the Brooks Range. But what I find interesting about the Nogahabara Sand Dunes is the fact that they are more than 100 miles away from the mountains. This shows that the glacial outwash streams brought the sand out from the Brooks Range all the way into the Kayakuk River Basin and down into where the Nogahabara Dunes are today. Much like the Kobuk Valley sand dunes, the Nogahabara sand dunes also got caught on a mountain range. In this case, the wind wasn't able to push the sand over the Nulato Hills, and instead built up a large area of dunes. These Nogahabara dunes have greatly shrunk due to vegetation. If you look around the sand dunes, you will immediately see these other inactive dunes that have been reclaimed by vegetation. Today, the sand dunes are migrating primarily to the south, and these dunes are much harder to visit than the Kobuk Dunes. They are in the Kayakuk National Wildlife Refuge. However, there are not specific expeditions to go to the Nogahabara Dunes. So instead, you would need to get permission and likely a local guide to visit them. The final aspect of these dunes that make them very interesting is their biodiversity. There are actually 2 species that are endemic to the Nogahabara Dunes and are found nearly nowhere else in Alaska. Those being the sandy tiger beetle and the Alaskan tiny shrew. The Great Kobuk Sand Dunes and the Nogahabara Sand Dunes are by far the 2 most famous sand dunes in Alaska. However, there is one more example I was able to find, and these are even further north, up by the Arctic Ocean. Looking north in the Arctic coastal plain, you will notice this lighter area that are the Pick Sand Dunes. These Pick Sand Dunes are the smallest of the ones we have covered so far, coming out to be around 7,000 acres in area. And their entire geologic history remains somewhat of a mystery. The modern theory involves the same sediment from the Brooks Range traveling north into the Arctic coastal plain and arriving in a now drained Arctic lake. Today, Tashekpuk Lake is said to be a remnant of this ancient large lake. But as the sediment was traveling from the Brooks Range, it would travel into this lake and be deposited on the lake bed. However, as the glaciers continued to melt, this lake would catastrophically drain into the Arctic Ocean, likely from a river such as the Ikpikpuk River here, finding a path into the ocean. This would leave the sand that was originally on the lake bed to be exposed to the surface. One thing that remains a mystery about these Pick Sand Dunes is the fact that they are only exposed in a few sections. Today, the sand dunes are only exposed around a few thermokarst lakes. The reason why the sparse Arctic vegetation hasn't encroached on these dunes is still a mystery that needs to be researched further. But overall, the Pick Sand Dunes are a very interesting example of an ancient Arctic lake that drained. But let's move out of Alaska and into Russia. Russia has 2 regions of glacially created dunes that I will cover. The first of these dunes are an 8,400 acre dune field named the Chara Sands. These Chara Sands are found within the Chara Basin in between the Kodar and Udokan mountains. The Chara Sands did not form during the last glaciation. Instead, they formed in a much earlier glaciation lasting from around 100,000 to 55,000 years ago. This glacial period is known as the Maruktin glaciation in Russia. This glaciation gave rise to the Sakukan Glacier over the Kodar Mountains. This glacier would erode the rocks within the Kodar Mountains that would eventually become the Chara Sands. And as the glaciation was coming to a close around 50,000 years ago, the glacial outwash streams brought the sand into the Chara Basin. However, the Chara Basin at this time was actually a glacially dammed lake. The Sakukan Glacier blocked the flow of the Chara River, causing the water that got into the basin to instead build up and form a glacial lake. And it is actually suggested that the Chara Sands formed as a river delta within this glacial lake. But of course, as the glacier continued to melt, the Chara River would become undammed, causing the lake within the Chara Basin to empty out and eventually flow back up towards the Arctic Ocean, This left the chara sands exposed to the surface, and these sands would eventually be picked up by winds and become the active dunes that they are today. Pictures of these chara sands look out of this world, with snow-covered orange dunes right near the foothills of snow-capped mountains. The next glacially formed sand dunes in Russia are the most extensive, covering over 100,000 acres of area. These are the Tukulans of Siberia, specifically within the central Yakutian basin near the Lena and Vilyui rivers. The sand which forms these Tukulans formed all throughout the last glaciation, beginning around 110,000 years ago. In Siberia, this glaciation is notable for its two periods, known as the Zuryan glaciation and the Sartan glaciation. Both of these periods saw glaciers over the Verkhoyansk mountains. These glaciers would scrape the mountains down to create the sand of the Tukulans today. Then, of course, the glaciers melted, causing the sediment to be picked up within the glacial outwash streams. However, what makes these Tukulans different is the fact that they represent old alluvial braiding within the river that then got activated due to the wind. Alluvial braiding occurs when sediment output is very high in a river, and this causes rivers to branch apart into many small streams with small islands in between them. Today we see how the Lena River forms a very wide alluvial braiding floodplain due to the sediment that comes off the Verkhoyansk mountains. So as you can imagine, when there was even more sediment coming into the river due to the glaciation, the Lena River floodplain would be even wider and it would braid even more. So essentially, the sands of the Tukulans represent areas that the Lena River used to flow into and alluvial braid. But of course, eventually the river switched course, leaving the sand in these areas to get picked up by the wind. Today, as you can probably notice by just looking at a satellite map, these dunes are migrating to the southeast. These dunes, much like the ones I have previously mentioned, are also being reclaimed by vegetation. However, forest fires in these areas have been found to reactivate the dunes. So these have been the two dune fields in Russia. One formed as a glacially dammed lake in a valley, whereas the other ones are formed from alluvial braiding of a river. But now let's move on to Canada. Canada has two dune fields I'll talk about. The first one is very noticeable. These are the Lake Athabasca sand dunes. Altogether, these dunes make up around 75,000 acres of area, and this actually puts them as the largest active sand dunes in North America. These dunes are directly south of Lake Athabasca, which gives us a hint that they formed in a similar way to the Pick sand dunes or the Chara sands. This is the Athabasca Basin. This is a somewhat oval-shaped geologic province that is notable for having an abundance of sandstone. So, as the glaciers were scouring this landscape, it broke apart the sandstone and turned it back into sand. Then, as the Laurentide ice sheet melted, it left behind Glacial Lake McConnell, a very large glacial lake which Great Bear Lake, Great Slave Lake, and Lake Athabasca all derive from today. So the eroded sandstone of the Athabasca Basin already found itself within a glacial lake. However, much like many glacial lakes, this lake would not last. Instead, the land started to rise due to isostatic rebound, or the rebounding of land after the pressure of an ice sheet leaves. This isostatic rebound of the land caused the lake to drain out more slowly than some of the other glacial lakes that catastrophically drained. And as Lake McConnell shrank, eventually the Great Bear Lake, the Great Slave Lake, and Lake Athabasca would become their own separate glacial lakes, and even they would continue to shrink. Eventually, Lake Athabasca shrank to around its modern-day level, and this revealed the glacial sand that was originally a part of the lake bed. And of course, this sand was eventually picked up by wind, which is currently moving it to the east. Today, these sand dunes are fairly popular to visit, at least compared to the very isolated sand dunes I have covered thus far. They are part of Saskatchewan's Athabasca Sand Dunes Provincial Park, and they can be accessed either by plane or by boat, crossing Lake Athabasca from some of the cities that are on the lake. The next dunes in Canada are very unique. This is because they are not found in an isolated area. Instead, they are found near a very populated urban area. These are the Penny Sand Dunes, less than 10 miles away from Ottawa's downtown. The sand which formed these sand dunes were not part of a lake system. Instead, the sand was deposited into the Champlain Sea. This was a glacially created sea which fills the valleys of the modern-day Ottawa and St. Lawrence River. However, at this time, it was not a river or a lake. Instead, it was comprised of brackish waters because it was connected to the ocean. Despite the Champlain Sea no longer existing today, and instead becoming the St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers, it has left its mark as the fertile land within this St. Lawrence Valley, where Montreal, Quebec City, and Ottawa are all found in today. So our Penny Dunes here are simply an area where sand was exposed to the surface and picked up by wind. But as I mentioned before, what makes these sand dunes unique is the fact that they are found in an urban area. And because of this, they have greatly shrunk from their former size. Originally, the Penny Sand Dunes were around 370 acres. However, today, they are found in just 4 small dune areas. And this has primarily been due to human causes. In the 1950s, pine species were planted all around these dunes, causing the active dunes to shrink. And, as you've probably noticed, there have been roads and other residential areas built on top of these dunes, shrinking them even farther. Today, these sand dunes make up a small park. The land is owned by the National Capital Commission, and the Biodiversity Conservancy International has been trying to restore the dunes and protect them. I just think that the Penny Sand Dunes are particularly interesting due to their placement right near the capital of Canada. Now that we have covered dunes in Alaska, Russia, and Canada, let's go back to the US for our final 2 dunes. In eastern Idaho, a feature that stands out are the St. Anthony Dunes. And despite being the furthest south of any of the dunes I've talked about in this video, they are still glacially formed. This region of Idaho did not specifically get glaciated, and in fact, the Laurentide ice sheet did not make it this far south. However, there were glaciers within the Yellowstone Plateau found just to the east of these dunes, and it was this glacier that the sand came from. Much like the Pic Sand Dunes, Lake Athabasca Sand Dunes, and Chara Sands, the sand here found itself within a glacially created lake named Lake Terraton. This glacial lake is the smallest of the glacially created lakes that I have talked about thus far. However, it was still significant in collecting the sediment coming from the Yellowstone Plateau. Around 10,000 years ago, the glaciers within the Yellowstone Plateau began to melt, and this entire area became drier. Eventually, Lake Terraton here would shrink down to almost not existing today, except for the very small mud lake here. However, you can see how it has left its mark on the landscape by creating the fertile farmland. But as the lake dried up, the revealed sand would be picked up by the wind and blown towards the northeast. However, the sand came in contact with the juniper buttes, which prevented it from being blown more to the northeast, except on this eastern end. So over time, these St. Anthony Dunes have grown to be around 10,600 acres and more than 400 feet tall. But that brings us to the final example of glacier-created dunes, at least for this video. These dunes are one of the smallest we have covered, coming out to be just 40 acres, and they are privately owned in Maine. This is the Desert of Maine. Similar to the Penny Sand Dunes, the Desert of Maine did not form within a lake. Instead, it formed within the ocean. After the glaciers left Maine, the coast was found as much as 175 to 245 meters below its current level. This bay would receive the sediment from the eroded Longfellow Mountains and other mountains in the north of Maine. However, this sediment isn't actually sand. Instead, it is the even finer grained silt. Eventually, after the glaciers left, isostatic rebound began raising the land of Maine back to its modern-day coastline levels. But instead of revealing this sand to the surface, it would actually be covered in a layer of topsoil. So how did the 40 acres of this glacially created silt be exposed today? Well, that is actually from human causes. In 1797, a farmer named William Tuttle bought 300 acres of land within this area of Maine. On these 300 acres, he built a farm, and actually had a fairly successful farm business for many years. However, their farming and grazing techniques were not sustainable, and eventually the topsoil began to wear away. Eventually, the Tuttle family would find a strange patch of silt within their land, and this patch of silt would continue to grow as the topsoil continued to erode. While the Tuttle family tried to salvage it, eventually, in the early 1900s, they evacuated the property. At the time they had abandoned the property, the roughly 40 acres of silt around today had been exposed. Then, in 1919, a businessman named Henry Goldrup would buy the property and turn it into the successful Desert of Maine tourist attraction that it is today. And even though the Desert of Maine is not technically a desert since it gets too much rainfall, this Desert of Maine is by far the most visited out of the ones I have covered. The desert itself, of course, is a tourist attraction, even featuring a statue of a camel, but there is also a mini golf course and ice cream shop, and cabins if you want to stay at the dunes. But that brings us to the end of this video. Glacially created sand dunes are definitely an overlooked way on how sand dunes formed. Many of the dunes I have covered in this video have been called a geologic or geographic oddity, or an out-of-place sand dune. But it is important to recognize the geologic process that formed these dunes, and the fact that they are not an oddity, and there are actually many of these dunes all around the world. There are undoubtedly many more examples of glacially formed sand dunes, so if you know of an example, comment them below. But if you watched this far, thank you, and I hope you learned something new. I will see you guys in the next video.